legend lives on from the Chippewa on down of the big lake they call Gitchagumi.
9790 KFGO. Good afternoon and welcome back to The Drive. KFGO time coming up on 4/11. Thanks for being with us today. Tomorrow is the 45th anniversary of the sinking, the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. What happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald that day? Gale force winds on the Great Lakes caused it to take on water and sink, but to this day, we still don't exactly know what happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald. So that's why we rely on experts like Frederich Stonehouse, who is a maritime historian, author, lecturer, and more. He's authored over 30 books on maritime history, many of them focusing on the Great Lakes, and contributed to several others. The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the Great Lakes Lighthouse Tales, our regional bests, A Wreck Ashore, the U.S. Life-Saving Service on the Great Lakes. You can see he's got quite a history. He's been a consultant for both the U.S. National Park Service and Parks Canada, has been an on-air expert for National Geographic, the History Channel, Fox Family, as well as many regional media productions. He's been handed out so many different awards, including Northern Michigan University's Distinguished Alumni Award in 2014. He's been a man all and around the Great Lakes area, and he joins us today on the day before the 45th anniversary of the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald to talk about what happened. Let's say good afternoon to Mr. Frederich Stonehouse. Good afternoon, sir.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me on.
It's absolutely our pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today. So is it Dr. Stonehouse, Frederick?
No, Frederick works well.
All right. Well, Frederick, let's just start at the top. What happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald?
That's the $25 question that we don't have the answer to. As you alluded to on the introduction, here we are 45 years later, and we still do not definitively know what caused the steamer to sink.
So there have been many dives on the Edmund Fitzgerald. It broke up when it went under. You've written a book on the Edmund Fitzgerald. Perhaps we can do our very best with your insight, Mr. Stonehouse, and kind of come to some type of best guess as to what happened. You wrote a book on the Edmund Fitzgerald. Let's go back to 1975. The storm comes up on the Great Lakes as the Edmund Fitzgerald, the Fitz, the queen of the Great Lakes, is trying to make it into Whitefish Bay with a big load of iron ore. Can you take the story from right there?
I certainly can. Well, she was downbound from Superior, Wisconsin, bound for Detroit, and the automobile works there with about 27,000 long tons of ore, and that's enough iron to make about 7,500 cars.
Wow.
Remember, those were real cars back in 1975, not the little things we're driving today. But she would get in increased trouble from weather as she proceeded down the lake. She was being followed by another ship, the Arthur M. Anderson. Fitzgerald lost both of her radars in the storm, so Anderson was kind of keeping track on the Fitz with hers. And as they were about 15 miles from Whitefish Point is an area where she could have pulled in behind and been in relative safe waters since the winds were coming northwest, kind of behind the Fitzgerald. In some cases, the gusting was in excess of 90 miles an hour, building seas as high as 30 or 35 feet. Certainly extreme conditions for a freighter on the Great Lakes. But about 15 miles short of Whitefish Point, she suddenly dove for the bottom, literally dropping off the radar return of the Anderson, her lights going out and simply disappearing. The ship would be, of course, Coast Guard would be notified, rescue efforts would be made, but there was nothing that could have been done for the men aboard that ship. It simply all happened too quickly. Following May, they were able to locate the hull of the ship using side-scan sonar, found it in about 550 feet of water. Two pieces, the pilot house, the forward half of the ship sitting upright, the stern of the ship upside down, and then hull damage in between the two of them. There were a series of course, Coast Guard investigations, National Transportation Safety Board investigation. The owners group, the Lake Carriers Association, did another investigation. They all concluded that they really didn't have a definitive answer. The best answer may have been from the Transportation Safety Board, which had concluded that water had come across her deck, her spar deck, piled in behind the pilot house, as the waves broke down the open deck of the ship. They struck the rear of the pilot house, piled higher, and that water depth would have been enough to collapse the forward hatches on the ship. And once that happened, there was enough water going into it that she simply dove for the bottom, plowing her bow into the mud of the bottom of Lake Superior, the torquing action causing the stern of the ship to flip on its back, literally breaking off as a section from the ship and sinking next to it. And that seems to be a theory that has a lot of folks thinking it likely happened. That said, in the intervening years, maritime architects have come forward and said, no, we think that perhaps she was structurally not as sound as she should have been. Accusations made, well, maintenance that should have happened during the winter wasn't done, and therefore she was weak. Other arguments being that, nope, she was too close to a small, shallow area, and in the prevailing weather conditions simply bottomed out, literally fracturing the hull at that point. Didn't say anything to anybody, may not even have been aware she hit based on the extreme wave action, and simply staggered on and sank.
There is...
And if you want to believe in flying saucers, you can say that too, because none of those things I described are definitively provable.
No, they're not. We're being joined by Frederich Stonehouse. He is an expert on the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Tomorrow is the 45th anniversary of the wreck in 1975, and Frederick is going to be putting on a presentation tomorrow about the Edmund Fitzgerald that we're going to talk about. So we're very fortunate to have him with us today. Some of the last radio communications with the Edmund Fitzgerald talked about how some of the cargo hold covers had been gone, had been torn off, and they were taking on water. Do you think that contributed?
Well, the actual transmission from Fitzgerald talked about a vent top being broken open, and a vent top was an air relief mechanism from one of the cargo holds. It was a pipe about 8 inches in diameter, came up through the spar deck or the main deck of the ship. So if that was broken open, that would have allowed water to enter to the cargo hold. Once the water was in the cargo hold, there was no effective way, given the design of the ship, to pump it out. So she could gradually have been flooding in that manner. Possible. Other discussions with the captain was he's also lost the fence rail. The fence rail is that wire rope railing system that goes around the perimeter of the ship to keep folks from falling off. But again, a clue, a maybe, something, but nothing that really was absolutely definitive as to what happened.
Some people believe a rogue wave hit the Edmund Fitzgerald. I think in recent years, the science trying to discover if there are rogue waves has proven that there are rogue waves. Whether or not one hit the Edmund Fitzgerald that night is not certain. But Frederich Stonehouse, our guest today, Mr. Stonehouse, can you describe what it must have been like to have a 35-foot wave regularly hitting your boat on the Great Lakes? I mean, that seems stunning that can actually happen on the Great Lakes.
It certainly can. There have been waves reported in excess of 40 feet. That said, the highest measured wave has been about 28 feet. But that would have been a staggeringly strong impact to that vessel. I mean, even though the ship is 729 foot long and a massive freighter, it still is really just a chip of wood when the Great Lakes become angry. And that would have been pounding into her, depending on direction it was coming from, with extreme ferocity. So I spoke with the captain of the Arthur Anderson following her after the wreck, and he reported seeing a wave high enough and large enough to come down on the stern of his pilot house in the rear and break through the lifeboat davit covers he had in the stern. And he said, Fred, those boats are 40 foot off the water. So that wave would have been in excess of 40 feet.
That's absolutely incredible. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but just talking about the legacy of the Edmund Fitzgerald, has anything changed? Frederich Stonehouse is our guest. He is a author and speaker, expert on the Edmund Fitzgerald. I would I would assume that with this news, that things would have changed on the Great Lakes after the Edmund Fitzgerald went down, that under certain conditions you're not allowed to launch anymore, or if conditions get like this, you have to go ashore immediately. Did anything change about how shipping is?
There were two major changes that occurred. One is amongst the sailors themselves, a greater awareness of the vulnerability of the ships and a greater respect for Lake Superior. So you anecdotally began to see more ships laying in voluntarily, coming to shelter when the weather really got bad than you previously had seen. Previously, there was more of a, we're going to punch your way through, the ship can take it attitude. Now you became far more cautious. The other big change was weather forecasting. At the time of the Fitzgerald, there was precious little forecasting equipment on the lakes, either in terms of automatic reporting buoy systems or shore stations. But after Fitzgerald, we began to see that increase dramatically. And those were the two big changes that occurred because of Fitzgerald.
We're being joined by Frederich Stonehouse, who is author, speaker, talented man. He's an expert with the Edmund Fitzgerald. 45 years ago tomorrow, the Edmund Fitzgerald will go down. It's been compared to the Titanic of the Great Lakes. The tragedy, of course, yes, but a lot of people think that the Edmund Fitzgerald was this big, hulking, rusty old tank of a boat. Nothing could be further from the truth. Frederick, this vessel was the Cadillac of the sea, wasn't it?
Well, she was considered to be the pride of the line, and the shipping line she was part of, Ogilvy Norton, one of the finest on the Great Lakes. Every year before fit-out, these ships are examined for seaworthiness. The American Bureau of Shipping goes through them. Coast Guard inspection crews go through it. 5 years, you get a full hull inspection. There was nothing by the process used to indicate that anything was wrong with this ship beyond being thoroughly seaworthy.
So, Mr. Stonehouse, there's some 240-plus ships that have been lost off Whitefish Point now, including the Edmund Fitzgerald. Has anything changed about the routing?
Well, you only have so many choices on Lake Superior, and in effect, no, the routing has not changed. Traditionally, during the fall of the year, the shipping traffic will tend to go along the north shore of the lake because the winds will predominantly be north-northwest, and during the summer, they'll cut it straight through and under much calmer conditions. But we have to understand that the 7,500 ships wrecked on the Great Lakes, about 30,000 sailors lost their lives. So the Fitzgerald has really become part of not only the legend of the lakes, but also an icon that represents all of those lost ships and all of those sailors.
What a tragedy. What an absolute tragedy. The Maritime Museum off Whitefish Point tomorrow will be having a ceremony. They'll have, you hear it in the song, too. Everybody knows about the 29 chimes. It will actually ring 30 times tomorrow, 29 for every man lost on board the Edmund Fitzgerald and one more for all the sailors lost at sea. Can you tell us tomorrow what you're going to be doing?
What we'll be doing from the Marquette Museum will be, of course, a virtual ceremony. I'll be doing a presentation on the history of the Fitzgerald and what happened on that storm. And that will be then followed by ringing the bell 29 times plus one, which will then be followed by a maritime concert by one of our local musicians. So it's our small way of recognizing Fitzgerald. But at the same time that's happening, there'll be another ceremony going on at Split Rock Lighthouse up on Lake Superior, then the east end or west end of the lake. There'll be another one going on at not only Split Rock in Duluth. There'll be another one downstate. There'll be another one at the Mariners Church. All around the Great Lakes, there will be a ceremony in some cases in memorization of the Edmund Fitzgerald and her crew.
Frederich Stonehouse, our special guest today, talking about the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. One last thing on the way out today. Mr. Stonehouse, this has obviously gotten into your psyche, under your skin. Why are you so devoted to maritime stories, to the Edmund Fitzgerald, and to the Great Lakes?
Well, maritime stories, because maritime history is really the history of man, and that is where it all starts. Nothing happened without a boat or some way of crossing water. And the Fitzgerald, because it represents really the end game of what we've had for shipwrecks on the lakes. This is the last one. There has not been one since, and hopefully we will not see more. But the Fitzgerald represents so many threads of history, so many threads of humanity, that it just is something that becomes consuming in terms of knowing it, studying it, and talking about it.
Great Lakes historian Frederich Stonehouse of Marquette, author of The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald 40th Anniversary Edition. How do we get your books on the Edmund Fitzgerald and other maritime disasters and stories?
The same way we buy everything, Amazon.com.
It's that simple these days. I tell you what, I am so in your debt. Frederich Stonehouse, author, historian, award winner. I wish I could be at your event tomorrow, but it's going to be virtual, so anybody can log in?
Anybody can log in.
There it is. We'll do a Google search for you, sir. Mr. Stonehouse, I am in your debt. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with us and your knowledge.
Well, again, thank you very much for allowing me the privilege of doing so.
Take care, sir. Thank you.
Bye.
KFGO time is coming up on 4/26. Boy, what a sad anniversary tomorrow. The 45th anniversary of the downing of the Edmund Fitzgerald. You're listening to The Drive on the Mighty 790 KFGO.
The dawn came late and the breakfast had to wait.
Hey, coming up Tuesday in the KFGO Morning Crew, Minnesota State Patrol looking for some new recruits. We'll find out the details.
Also, licensed registered dietitian Elizabeth Meyer will be joining us. Is it better to exercise indoors or outdoors?
That's Tuesday in the KFGO Morning Crew, and the fun begins at 5 a.m.
Tuesdays at the Speedway Steakhouse and Event Center, it's bingo, bingo, bingo. Let me hear you shout it. Bingo! That's what I'm talking about. Higher cash prizes, TVs, purse giveaways, and no cap.